Welcome everybody to episode number 8. We're in our group discussion and we have Santi and Tristan joining me to discuss the problem of scientific objectivity. And so that is a quite difficult topic. So as usual, I'm going to just do a small recap of the main ideas, not everything, because I don't want to just repeat. You can watch the episode, the solo episode, and then I'm going to see what Tristan and Santi are thinking about this topic. Let's see. Welcome to the Philosophy in Real Life podcast, where we strive to live meaningful lives by pursuing truth and unmasking the lies in our culture. I'm your host, Carlos Santos, a philosophy PhD from Spain. Welcome to Season 2, The Ethics of Desire. So, Santi and Tristan, as you probably already know, I was trying to really come up with this ordinary understanding of the word objective and the word subjective. And so the first thing that comes to mind when people hear the word objective versus subjective is typically that it is scientific somehow, whatever that means for most people, right? Because then if you ask somebody, what do you mean by that? They will stumble over the words and they will not know fully what to say. But for the sake of this episode, let's just define, I'm going to try to define what people generally mean by that. And so I would say that by objective, people typically mean impersonal. You know, it's a set of criteria that is not dependent on one person's view of reality, you know? And then subjective would be just your personal preference or viewpoint to a matter. And that's that. And so we could say that then objective is impersonal and subjective is just personal. And I was saying that in the scientific rationality, or so to speak, the objectivity of the empirical sciences has at least two requirements. So the first one was that for it to be scientific, it has to be an explanation or a disengaged view of reality. And so in the words of Thomas Nagel, we can think of the view from nowhere. That's the way he does it. So it basically is how reality would be described if human beings didn't exist. It's like not taking into account how we view reality. And then you have the second requirement is that the object of study is basically physical objects. So they are physical objects, and therefore they are physical metrics such as size, roundness, and things like that. And so we actually talked about here the idea of primary qualities and secondary qualities. The primary qualities will be those qualities that can be measured objectively. By that, I mean like size, the weight of something, and things like that. So things that you can describe in mathematical language. And the secondary qualities will be basically the perception of that object, but filtered through our cognitive capacity, right? So you can think of taste or smell and things like that. So these wouldn't be properties of things themselves, but rather just how you see these things from your point of view, from your personal point of view. And so that's basically what we see. And now this is closely related to this idea of naturalism or scientism, this is more a philosophical belief about knowledge and how we arrive at truth. And one of the things that I pointed out in the previous episode was that the big problem with scientism or naturalism is the belief that all truth has to be scientific, basically. That all truth has to be scientific. And so that was a big issue because then it almost neglects or ignores other methods of inquiry or arriving at truth. And so the question is, okay, what do we do with that, right? Because can we use the method from the empirical sciences to then apply that to the study of morality or human behavior and things like that? And I think that the biggest problem is that that assumption is not even a scientific finding. The idea that all truth has to be scientific is more a philosophical belief about knowledge and how we arrive at truth rather than a scientific finding. It's not something that you can prove through science, this statement about knowledge or about the utility of science as a tool to analyze reality. But anyway, so I would say that's basically a good summary of it. I don't know if I can open the discussion for you guys to just see what you thought, or if you would put it differently, or what questions you have about it.
I struggled a lot with this episode, and I think your historical breakdown helped me understand why. And that's because a lot of these ideas that were established or really formed during the scientific revolution are just like such a part of our cultural waters, and all the ideas that we're just swimming in. And for me, like, objectivity is so tied to certainty.
I see.
And like I'm I think as a society, but maybe it's just me personally, like I'm addicted to certainty and being able to feel certain about what is true. So I'm like very uncomfortable with this idea that objective things oftentimes are very uncertain as well. And I was thinking about even the examples that you gave in like the courtroom or historical knowledge. And even in those realms, though, we like love scientific certainty. Like if there's like forensic evidence that somebody, fingerprints, boom, framed, done, certainty, versus other types of like eyewitness accounts. Or even like in the historical realm, you have ancient artifacts that are discovered, can be verified through science and empirical means that just provide you more of that, like, I can really believe this. So I struggled with it. I think it made sense, but there's just something that I'm like, I'm resisting this idea of a lack of certainty and objectivity.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. I think that the again, for those people, Santi is referring to the scientific revolution in the 1600s. It took just the Western countries, but I would say it was a global phenomenon. It's like, oh, the new science, the new way of understanding reality, and it yield a lot of success. I mean, a lot of enterprises and technology and the industry and and not only that, but the industrial revolution was basically the result of this technological progress and in science and things like that. And so, I mean, it's very hard but the question whether the problem is that we really enjoy that level of certainty in very narrow domains of reality. How many things we have to go through or like make decisions about, like topics and things like that, that we do not enjoy that certainty, that empirical certainty. I mean, you can think of relationships or who your friends are or who you marry or who you date or like whether or not having children. Like there are so many things that science is just mute, like it's silence. It's not that. Yeah, I think that a lot of people want to overextend the use of science, and then you see these tech talks about the formula for love according to science. So it was scientific. Whenever I read scientifically proven, I always smile. I was like, we'll see what this is. Let's see what this is about. You know what I mean? And even if you talk to people who are scientifically trained, but also philosophically trained, if you read philosophy of science and the history of science, you will realize that much of the history of science is actually the history of men, like just how they came up with these models to understand reality that were flawed. But I do believe in objectivity, but I'm saying like we need to get rid of this image of science as the infallible thing, like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, the way I saw it was like there exists truth and there exists ways to evaluate truth or to understand truth. And one of those ways that you can figure out or discover truth is through the scientific method and through objectivity. But there are other truths that doesn't necessarily apply to, that instrument doesn't necessarily apply to. And so, like, I don't know, maybe an example was like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like maybe if you think of like I think of like different types of like fruits or something like that, which I don't know, this might be a weird example or a weird metaphor, but like there's all kinds of different fruits, just as like there are all different kinds of truths. And some instruments can be applied to pick the same kinds of fruits, but then there's other instruments that you need to pick other kinds of fruits as well, right? Like
Yeah.
if I go to an olive tree, I might not use the same exact instrument that I would use
Yeah.
to pick apples off of an apple tree. And they're both real. They both exist. It's just that I can't use the same instruments to pick both. And so I think of all the different kinds of truths that exist with it out there in the ether. And the scientific method is really useful for some of those truths that we need about reality, but it's not necessarily great at other ones. And so one of the things I had thought of was like actually the idea of like actually it was ideas. Ideas was was one of the things that I thought about because I was just trying to think like, is there anything that exists out there that I believe to be true, but I can't physically test. And like one of those things was justice, right? Like I believe justice to be a real thing, but it's hard for me to you can't like although justice exists all over the place, right? I can't like how do you prove to me that idea is a real thing necessarily, right? Other than we apply justice in all kinds of but the application of justice is the same thing as the idea of justice. We just believe a priori that justice exists all over the world, and then we just act like it is. But it's really hard to test that objectively and to use any sort of material instruments to try to detect whether or not justice is a thing. We just sort of accept that it exists. So I thought that was one of the first things I had thought of. And then I had a conversation recently with somebody about, again, this is a little bit dumb, but it was about 9/11, and we were starting to talk about the moon landing and all that. But like I thought conspiracy theories was a really funny conversation to have with a person, because what makes conspiracy theories so interesting and also so fun or whatever is, if you like that sort of stuff, I like playing around with them, just because for me, like, I don't know, I just love arguing conspiracy theories. But the whole idea is there is a truth behind the theory, right? What really happened on 9/11 and what was really going on. And the whole concept is, and there's a truth about this thing, or flat earth. Let me take a less controversial topic, right? Either the earth is flat or it's not flat, and we all believe that there's a truth that can be discovered beyond that. But like sometimes, I mean, maybe flat earth isn't as good of an idea because you can actually test things, but
bueno,
I think 9/11
depends on who you ask.
It depends on who you ask, I guess,
because they tie this to corruption from the government.
Yeah, that's
and things
true.
Like that.
But so 9/11 is better because it's one event that happened one time, and you can't repeat it. So you have to arrive at that truth in some other way. And I think it's what I appreciated about it, but I think these were good examples of our belief in truth and our belief in our ability to arrive at truth, even without these instruments.
So I wanted to ask you,
I don't know what you think about that,
'cause-
Santi, though, if that makes you less struggle.
Wait, but
sorry,
hold
go ahead.
on. Before we dive into more like debate, like, do you feel like I explain the basic ideas properly, or do you feel like you still have some questions with some basic notion that I presented in the solo episode? Just to clarify for the
How would you
audience,
define objectivity then, based on what you're describing?
So objectivity is always a concept, is always dependent on the method of study. So basically, there is always a standard of success that we take for granted, or that we actually defend for that knowledge to be true or to be objective, meaning have that independent status. So whenever we talk about objectivity, it means independent. It's independent, meaning like it's true for you, for me, and for Plato, or for anybody who lived in the past. Regardless of what you think, this is true. Maybe, of course, we could, and my mind goes to so many nuances to that even claim, but so we could say that it's just this idea that, but it's always tied to a standard of success. So the empirical method, or the empirical sciences, they have a way of understanding rationality in a very specific way. So that's their standard of success. And whatever theory about reality, or whatever claim about how the world works, has to fulfill this set of criteria that has been, what you say, pre-established, and so that's the idea, is that if you don't meet the requirement of explaining reality from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel would say, and it's a physical object, or somehow it has positive energies or ways of measuring that, then that is not an object that can be studied by the empirical sciences. And then we would need to distinguish also about a scientific theory, which is also like a very different thing, because also that has a standard of success. So the scientific studies, there are so many that you have to control for variables and things like that for you to actually arrive at a claim. So and so it's very complicated. Even in the science of nutrition, there's this belief that red meat actually is bad for you, and it comes from this epidemiological study that they take the mass populations and they try to see the correlations of that. But again, correlation is not causation. So, but again, that is one way that scientific studies in nutrition science is carried out. You know what I mean? Typically, the people who eat often meat, they also have the Coke and the dessert and burger and all of that. So it's complicated to control the variables, right? And so we will need to study how red meat is bad for people who actually just read red meat with vegetables and things like that. But people are complicated, so it's really hard to encourage people to do one thing and obey the protocol. So as you can see, there's always a standard of success. There's always this set of criteria for that to be recognized as truth. Does that make sense? And so, but then of course we can think of moral truth or other kinds of truth. But I would say that what I wanted to show with this, with the problem with scientific objectivity, is not so much to deny that other methods of inquiry, they themselves have a method or a standard of success. No, it was to just almost like refute this myth that truth has to be scientific, because that's the only way that we arrive at truth. Is like, why? How do you know that is actually the case? And then you're like, well, that claim that knowledge has to be described in mathematical language or in scientific language, that claim itself cannot be proven scientifically. And so it's just a philosophical assumption about reality or knowledge and things like that.
Yeah, and it's like my pushback isn't at your conclusion. It's more that I think the reason it's like the scientific tools are the ones that feel like we can arrive at truth with the highest degree of confidence, and that the other tools that you discuss, we haven't really gotten into the tools, I guess, but in Tristan's analogy, all the other fruit picking tools just seem so much more ineffective. Or I don't think that I can have as great of a confidence that I've arrived at something that is true. Like that I think the truth exists in those other areas. Like I believe that justice exists as well. But I don't think that the other tools that seem applicable in those realms lead me to the same degree of confidence. And that's where I'm wrestling. And it's like, how can you say, well, I know the truth with these other tools when they seem to leave a lot more room for uncertainty than the scientific method?
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Wait, so that is why most people are naturalists or they believe in scientism,
Yes.
because
Yes.
the other methods cannot give you the same level of confidence about your findings
it's
or your
addictive.
claims about reality. But second, that doesn't necessarily imply that then science can be extrapolated in the same way to other domains and you do that. It's like,
Agreed.
so sorry,
Agreed.
you don't get, like, that would be changing the subject. That would be denying what we're trying to get at. And so, yes, so I would concede that in other domains of reality, that like our moral experience of the world, we do not enjoy the same level of certainty. And it seems to be that certainty does not belong to human beings in all domains. So yeah, so we have to just grieve and cry about it and move on, basically.
Where do you think that source of certainty comes from, or that confidence? Like, what about the scientific method makes us feel confident?
Well, it's predictable. You can
versus other
repeat.
things?
You can repeat it. It's predictable, and you can repeat the same outcome under the same conditions. So the scientific message is that, does water boil at 100 degrees Celsius when you heat up the atoms and things like that? Yes, always. You repeat the experiment in Italy, and if you have water, and if you heat it up to 100 degrees Celsius within our atmosphere and all of that, it will boil. You know what I mean? And so that is something that you can replicate that regardless of who replicates it.
Okay, but what about, so let's take the idea of justice that I mentioned before.
Yeah.
That's a moral claim. Justice, in many ways, is a moral claim, but you can see justice repeatedly existing in every culture in the human race. But why is there less confidence that justice exists than water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius?
Because of the content of the word justice. Because maybe for you, justice looks like one way, and for me looks, for example, for me maybe
it doesn't matter what it looks like. I'm asking, but the concept, it doesn't matter what it looks like.
But the concept is depending on the definition. Because words only matter if we have what they carry in themselves as the semantic meaning of the word.
Okay, but like just take the idea of,
for example, lion. What do we mean by lion? Okay, so
Okay,
a
that's
mammal.
that's a different thing. But I'm talking about the experience of. Okay, fine. You want to talk? Are you saying that you need a definition of justice? Is that what you're saying? That you
Well,
need me to define justice
I'm
for
saying
you?
that it's not as simple as the physical elements that you find outside yourself that can be that can be described primary qualities. Why? Because
Okay.
if you study the Greek societies, they understood justice in a very specific way, and the way we understand justice is very different from the past. For example,
But that's
justice.
okay. But that still exists. But it's still. But
But
okay, think fair. All right. How about this? Fairness. What if I said fairness? Do you feel like that's if I said? Do you think that there's any human being on planet Earth that has never experienced fairness or a lack of fairness?
and well, I would say yes.
Has
But
anybody
hold
ever?
on.
Yeah.
But you have to define it. You have to define it.
Okay.
And so that's
all right.
that's
Example,
the complicated part about values is that the problem is that they are dependent on linguistic expression and the way.
Okay, fine. All right. Let me give you a definition. Let me try to give you a definition then. All right. I feel like I deserve a certain thing and somebody took some action towards me or against me and did some and I did not receive what I deserved. Whatever that might be. I don't know. That's a really poor definition of fairness. But that's I think that that's a human experience that every single person has felt at some point or another. Whether somebody got their food stolen, whether somebody felt like their child died and they shouldn't have died, whether they felt like they got sick and they shouldn't have gotten sick, like, and every person has experienced the emotion of whatever just happened was unfair. It was not fair that happened to me. Like, it's every human being has experienced that. No matter, it doesn't matter where you live in society, whether you're a Greek or a Roman or living in Papua New Guinea or in ancient Mesopotamia. Every single human being has had the same human experience in which something happened to them and they felt I didn't deserve that. It was unfair.
Okay.
That's why war. That's literally why like war is one of the most common human experiences. That's half of war is literally that.
Yeah. Okay. But all right. So I understand that at the lived experience level, that you have this sense of like something was done to you or something was not done to you that you feel like you should have received or like you shouldn't have been treated that way or something like that. Yes, but here moral vocabulary and moral words matter because they help us distinguish different things. You know what I mean? And so it's not the same thing that we are betrayed by our partners compared to we were given the wrong paper by this administrator. Even though we feel like there was a misalignment of what we needed to receive or what we think that we needed and what we got in the end. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
so one thing is like a mistake from the administrator and the other thing is like, no, a betrayal. You see what I mean? It's like words matter because of that. And so the problem is that what I'm trying to say, for example, is that in warrior societies, justice was understood in a very different way to now. But in other ways, it does overlap. For example, we can think of human dignity in the polis, in the Greek polis. I mean, the democracy, the way we understand democracy, the same word, but in the democracy of the Athens and all of that, slaves were not included as a category, women neither, and just men and men of a certain kind. But that's democracy. But yes, we're using the same word, but we don't mean exactly the same thing. Does that make sense? And not only that, but now you bought the political party, not so much one person. And so that's what I'm trying to say with these things is that yes, there's a reality that they are trying to encapsulate, but how that is understood culturally in a specific historic community, it is very different to how we understand those words now, for example.
I feel like, but maybe we're misunderstanding because what I'm applying the same. So the conversation that we had in the last few episodes was about good, and we keep coming to the same thing. It doesn't matter that your definition of what good is; it's the idea of goodness existing at all.
Yeah,
I'm applying that same logic to the word justice. It doesn't matter to me what your definition of justice is and what justice means to you. But you cannot go anywhere without the idea of justice in some form existing in a culture.
Yes. Okay. So as a formal category, yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm saying that's a repeatable experience. It's a repeatable idea. Does that make sense? Whether I'm not talking about what it looks like. I'm just saying, as an idea, justice seems to exist across cultures, across every human being, in the same way that the ultimate good exists. And how it gets applied and what it actually looks like and what its specific definition is going to vary. But the idea exists. And if that's repeatable, why can't we have, or why don't we have, the same level of confidence about that concept, that moral concept, if it is repeatable, as we do, again, the water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm getting my idea across.
Well, it is, and okay, it is not, and it is, because we're dealing, in the case of the empirical sciences, we're dealing with a physical object, and in the case of justice, we are dealing with a non-physical object. Does that make sense?
Right.
And because of that, this is depending on our recognition and then the way we articulate or understand that historically. And I'm not saying that that makes it relative or that everything goes. It's more complex than that, because on the one hand, we need to recognize that it's depending on our linguistic capacity to use words and give meaning to these words somehow, by trying to define reality the way we see it. But on the other hand, we also have to recognize this independent status. This seems to be like they rise above our preferences, and it seems to be like a moral order or a moral law above us, right? And so how do you contend with these things? It's very difficult. It's not easy. But that's the topics of the next episode, right? That's the topic of the next episode. Yeah. But I would say that it's not the same thing. Even just generally speaking, it's not the same thing because it's not a physical object. Justice is not waiting outside of you, regardless of what you say about justice. The chair is there, regardless of how you call it, right? But the justice is not there, regardless how you define it.
No, and I totally feel that. Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at, I'm questioning this. What I'm really trying to question is what makes you feel confident about the empirical sciences? The response is it's repeatable. It's predictable and repeatable. That's what makes me feel confident about the empirical sciences. There's two concepts, or there's two factors that make you feel confident. And maybe there's more, right? And we can kind of talk through those. But like, if one of those is repeatability or predictability, I think it's interesting that we have other concepts, right, that are not physical, like justice, for example, but they are repeatable. By repeatable, what I mean by is they seem to exist predictably across culture. So it's interesting that we don't have the same level of confidence. So then this other thing that you said, right? Well, maybe it's because I can touch this physical thing, but because I can't touch this thing, maybe that's why I have less confidence in this thing. Okay, but that's also strange to me. That's a strange thing, because everybody would say love. It's really hard for someone to say that ideas, like if like an ideas are not tangible. But who is going to deny that ideas do not exist?
Well, that's it. So now for the audience, this in academic philosophy is called ontology, the study of being, of what is and what is not. And is a difficult verb because we can mean many things. It's not the same thing to say the chair is there and compared to my idea is, or I have many ideas that are about something. Does that make sense? And so what I'm trying to say, and you're getting a crucial philosophical issue, is that the way we talk about existence, the existence of something or the reality of something has to be understood in a pluralistic way, so to speak. There's not this univocal or like this one way of understanding existing. Yes, there is material existence as physical objects of physicality, but then you have another domain, so to speak, of existence, that the ideas exist, right? But they exist in a very different way because they are not physical as such, And then you have the values and things like that. And so even, but you are proving a great point, is that yes, we have been trained, or we take for granted that it's less problematic to talk about the existence of things in physical terms. And somehow we have been trained to be skeptical about the reality of things in this non-tangible way. And yes, for a lot of, for example, for the Eastern tradition, physicality has to be, we should be suspicious of physicality because everything is an illusion and we are actually united. You can think of Maya, right? This illusion that actually we are a total unity, but our senses deceive us and makes us see each other as something apart from each other. But there is this oneness to everything. And so in this case, in that tradition, if we are embedded in that tradition, we would be more skeptical or suspicious of physical certainty rather than this imaginative or this reality that everybody's together, really. Does that make sense? But yeah, I mean,
Yes.
anyways.
It's well, okay. So where I'm stuck, here's where I'm stuck. Tristan is getting at, like, we can get a large group of people to have a high degree of confidence in its existence, but with things that are physical and measurable, not only can we comment on their existence, but also on their properties and the implications to a much higher degree. Like, you might be able to get across a lot, pretty much unanimity on the existence of justice as a concept, but then from there on, it's nothing but disagreement about what is just and who is being just, or what is more just.
Yeah.
And if there's an objective truth to all of that, we seem to be really bad at finding it and agreeing on it. And that's why I'm like, these tools just seem very ineffective at discovering that truth.
But at the same time, to Tristan's point, and exactly, so we're getting at the problem with the non-physical objects and why scientism has this popularity among people, because it's almost more believable. It's easier to believe that than to believe that maybe there are other ways of existence or modes of existence, of values and ideas, and that not everything has to be tangible in that way to be true. And so that's why I'm saying, like, the same thing, we have music as a category, we can think of truth, and then you have different genres, you have blues, then you have rock and roll, then you have reggaeton, like you have all kinds of genre, but then all of it is understood under the umbrella of music, right? And so in this way, we could think of truth and then genres of truth. You have the scientific truth, and then you have other ways of understanding. But I like what Tristan says, because as soon as you start reflecting long and hard about this issue about truth and what different things that we actually talk about, like ideas or justice, we realize that it is almost like we are forced to come up with more language that can account for that type of reality. It's almost like just by looking at your lived experience and what you do, it's almost like you are forced to look beyond this scientific objectivity, because the way you live your life is actually predicated on this assumption that there is something beyond scientific truth. For example, anytime you actually build a relationship or you engage with somebody in a deeper way, that is almost like you are betting, you are trusting. It's like you are trusting that this person is good or that in some ways worth trusting. And so, but if you are suspicious of moral worth, then the whole thing falls down. Like you have, like in a way, there is like a basic belief that you already have, even though you are not willing to admit it at an explicit level, of like you actually believe things that are not scientifically proven, but that somehow your belief on these things is almost a prerequisite to act as a human being. I mean, I don't have a time machine to know that my wife will be faithful 10 years later. I don't, but I know. You see, is that there is relational truth, so to speak. It is such something that you have to experience it, and that's why betrayal from a partner is such a traumatic event, because it almost flips your world upside down. It's almost like, I could not believe it. It's like I really thought that she was being faithful to me and she was not. It's almost like you were faced with a reality that you could not even imagine. But if we did not believe in some form of, what would you say, love or trust, let's not even talk about love, because some people just associate that to romantic love, but some form of trust as a value that is subjective and that exists and that actually unites relationships across cultures and time. If that didn't exist in some form, we would not have relationships of any kind. So it's almost like we already believe in these things, otherwise we would not be able to live. Does that make sense? So the proof is in the pudding. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I have a quick question on that. How much does the origin of those objective realities matter? Because one of the conversations I had recently was about, I think a lot of my friends in my circle think that these morals exist, but are a product of evolutionary biology and human beings trying to survive and try to find the behaviors that are most optimal, and the people that trusted more in relationships were the ones that survived more. And so then that became sort of this this repeated value in our society because we evolved to trust, as an example. So I'm curious, like, assuming that a lot of people believe that, how much does that undermine the values in your mind, and how important is actually the origin of this morality to this conversation?
Yeah, I think if we were to put it into a question, we would say something like, can morality emerge just from biology or from evolution or things like that? And I think I have a problem with that, because I think that, well, the claim would be something like this, right? Let's try to define the claim from evolutionary biologists about morality. It would be something like this. Morality is just an evolved survival mechanism, a biological instinct that helps basically humans cooperate and reproduce. That's it, right? And so it's based on selfishness or something like that. The selfish gene, to quote here Richard Dawkins and things like that. The problem is that evolutionary biology can explain to some degree why we feel certain things, why we feel empathy, or why we feel, oh, because of the mirror neurons that we have in our brains and things like that, So it can explain actually mechanistically why we feel certain things, but it cannot explain why we should be empathetic. So it's almost feel like, okay, yes, empathy exists in this way, but why should we endorse or try to build a society based on empathy? It cannot give you the normative element. It just describes how we are, but it cannot explain why we ought to then build society in that way based on universal benevolence and things like that, even if it was useful for our survival. Why am I buying to do it that way still? Does that make sense? And so that's one of the issues. But the other issue is that if morality is just a byproduct of evolution, then it's not objectively binding. It's just a useful illusion, for the survival of the fittest. And so here we will have an issue, because in this case, if we just believe this, then any moral value that we actually endorse and protect in human rights and all of that is just basically a useful lie or construct, not actually truth, because it's just based on survival. And so in this case, our moral intuitions would not be aimed at truth, or we couldn't say that it's our truth. It would just be, I don't know, reproductive advantage or something like that. But we couldn't say more than that. We would just be left with that. So here will be the issue also is about the evolutionary biology as an enterprise, right? Because the evolutionary biologists trust rationality and trust that science as a way to arrive at truth. But if I were to use the same type of argument that evolutionary biologists use to actually talk about morality, I could say, hey, if we cannot trust our belief forming faculties to tell us the truth about the good, why should we trust our belief forming faculties to trust evolutionary science, for example, right? If it's just survival. So we could say that just science is also like a construct or something that we invent just to survive. But no evolutionary biologists actually would agree to that extent, because they would be fired, basically, because they would just be researchers of illusions and things like that. And so I find that problem is that it does not fully explain why we still need to follow these values if they are just useful and not truth. But I would say that if you were to push people, I would say, okay, so you are willing to say something like torturing children is just a useful illusion, like that we believe is bad. But most people would tell you, no, that's objectively wrong. And somehow across society and times, we all agree that sexually assaulting children is wrong, for example. Like, we shouldn't do that. It's not a good thing. It's not just a convenient fiction. But an evolutionary biologist will have to say that, yes, I know that we see this as wrong, but it's just a convenient fiction. It's just for survival, but actually it's not objectively wrong. It's just useful for our survival. And so they don't believe in objectivity. But then it's hard to explain, but I don't know. That's the best I can do right now. It's because
really
this
good.
is a very difficult topic, as you can see. But then again, if all truth is depending on survival and our sophisticated ways of saying things to survive, then why science? Why even talk? Why even debate? Does that make sense?
It's really helpful.
Also, if I can add something, the one thing, I guess, this question that I keep coming up, that I keep thinking about as well, is this idea of the idea. It seems to, and maybe I'm misrepresenting the evolutionary biologists, and I don't want to misrepresent the ideas, but it seems as though our instincts are given to us to help us survive, but it seems like morality it seems to get in the way of our instincts. And so then my question seems to be, I guess, why is there inconsistency between our evolutionary instincts and that apparently exists to help us survive, and then our morality, which is apparently a product of evolution that seems to work in contrast with what our instincts say? And so it's like, are both of these just a byproduct of evolutionary biology, or does some win out over the other, right? Because it's like, again, I think I was talking to someone the other day about this, right? Like, my desire to eat, for example, like, let's say I desire to, I'm going to keep it PG. There's many other examples I use with this person, but I may have a desire to eat a lot of sugar and cinnamon buns or something like that. But then there's this other side of me that recognizes that if I was to continue to do that, I'd eat myself to death. And I have this part of me that recognizes that my instincts are incorrect. And so, like, there's like these two opposing mechanisms that exists in one of the, but they're apparently both for my survival, except one actually leads to my destruction, and I require this other invented one, this apparently subjective. The only way that I can survive is by believing in what's apparently subjective, I guess. But why is that which is subjective? Why does that align closer to reality than my own instincts? Because
So
I don't know. I don't know. That's maybe I'm not vocalizing
an
it well, but yeah.
evolutionary biologist would tell you that we just have a sophisticated way of abstracting these needs, right? So for example, we realize that cooperating with one another is a more effective way long term to get our survival. So see, if I cooperate with you, you will cooperate when I'm in need. So as a strategy for survival, it's better long term to just be a nice player in the tribe, because then we would get along and we would do that. So they would use that as a way of saying, like, okay, this built-in intuition, moral intuition of cooperating is really aiming or serving our survival, but it's just a more sophisticated strategy to achieve the same aim as killing everybody and eating them or whatever, or eating their resources or their food. Does that make sense? And so we just got more intelligent about it, more long-term thinking when it comes to our survival. But the problem with that, which I think another thing, is that many times we have also competing instincts, and I think that, for example, you can think of the bombing of the Boston Marathon, right? A lot of people in that moment, they felt two instincts. One was to run away because to protect their own life, and another one of helping their gregarious instinct of like protecting their tribe or maybe family members or friends or whatever, just people there. So they have these two instincts competing, right? One is to run away and the other one is to stay and help your fellow human beings or whatever. And so here the problem is that the instincts cannot tell you what to do. There is still something that rises above these two competing instincts that is feeding, and then you realize that I actually should do this. And so even if we were to explain our feeling of empathy or helping one another or like survival or whatever at a level of evolutionary biology, in my estimation, that still is insufficient to account for our lived moral experience. That even when we have two competing instincts, we still have to somehow discern morally what instinct to give into or feed. Sometimes you have the instinct to run away, but somehow you feel like I need to be courageous and I need to go against fear and all of that. And many times that results in death. So it's not even survival. And so
Yeah.
I think that the evolutionary biology explanation of morality, it works well in some cases, but I feel like if you realize and try to understand from that framework more cases of our moral experience is insufficient, I would say.
Yeah. I feel like in practice, I struggle with its applications in practice because I also feel like I actually don't know this. I'm curious if other species go to war with each other because it seems like nothing has killed. I don't. This is a question. Has anything killed human beings more than other human beings? Like when it comes to
Probably.
human flourishing, right? Like I
Yeah.
think if you think about like our morality is what leads to human flourishing, but it's sort of like we. How do I say this? Society is like we kill each other. Like it's almost like we're really bad at doing human flourishing,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
If that's what evolution is bringing us to, it's like it's almost done a really poor job at that. And maybe that's it. Like, oh well, it's still correcting itself. I don't really know, but it's sort of like, but like I don't know if anything has killed more human beings than human beings. And what I'm curious about is if there are any other species out there that experience that, where like I don't know if dolphins kill other dolphins, because of ideas or whatever it is, right? Or spiders. I'm curious about that, or is it exclusive to?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So,
I'm
man,
actually not
I
sure.
have
I have no
this.
idea.
So there is this book by Alistair McIntyre about the morality of dolphins, and so I was reading it in the airport on the plane, and it's a really interesting read on ethics. Because
Yeah.
the idea was this dependency that we have with one another and our rationality and then morality. And so, of course, there has been debate about it, about species and how they behave and all of that. But again, it's very difficult to know, like, because we behave in one way, but we feel compelled to behave in another way. And so that discrepancy of what we do and what we ought to do is something quite unique, and it's very hard to know if dolphins feel the same unless we are dolphins. And so there is like limitations in our ruminations about dolphins morality. But what I would say is that yes, I mean, there has been analysis of chimps behavior and how they kill each other and the tribes and what they're willing to do and other species. But what I would say is that the whole argument, the Darwinian argument of like the survival of the fittest, is, so to speak, a proof that yeah, we kill each other because we're trying to survive, and that's that. For example, you have immorality, you have Nietzsche's type of thinking, who is an anti-humanist, and being an anti-humanist means basically being an anti-equality, universal benevolence, everybody. Actually, Nietzsche despised this European framework of ethics because he believed that this is for the weak. He actually was more of what would you say, that the powerful should reign and the slaves should be servants, and that's that, because that was the imposed order of nature, of the will to power, to survive, to make a name for yourself. And that would be an anti-humanist take, which is more in alignment with the Darwinian take of the survival of the fittest. The powerful has to reign because might makes power, or power makes. Yeah. So basically, is that if you can overcome people and you can do it, then that's it. That is yours. And if we were to apply this politically about who owns the land, is that whoever can defend it and whoever can attack the person that we're occupying and win. Yeah. So who has the right to the land? The winners. That's what Nietzsche would say. Not who was before. I don't care about all of that. That's just empty rhetoric from weak people. That's what Nietzsche. And so then you have the humanists, or the Europeans, oh no, human rights and all of that and things like that. And so here you can see how these things play out. But yeah. Anyways.
I know. I think maybe we can discuss more in the next episode, I suppose. But it's really, there's a million thoughts that.
Yeah. So okay. Yes, we need to wrap it up. Hold on. So as you can, so something to say to the audience. As you can see, this is a complicated subject, and I've been trying to play devil's advocate to just show people that coming to this framework of objectivity is actually a quite complicated matter, and it's actually quite human. We have these conceptions of reality, but somehow we still see the value of truth as a category, or trust, something that is binding to all of us, and we cannot do away with. It's almost like it's there somehow, even though we betray that and we find sophisticated way of bypassing that, using power to oppress others and things like that. Even if we are terrible at doing human flourishing, somehow we still have a sense of right and wrong. Okay. So that's, I would say, so far what we achieved so far in our discussion. So in the next episode, I will present how we can conceptualize just one way. This is my proposal to you, my philosophical proposal of how we can conceptualize moral objectivity and a productive path forward, in having a moral dialogue with one another. Okay. And then we'll discuss this also in our last episode of part 1 from Desire to Morality, which I'll discuss with Santi and Tristan these difficult ideas again. But thank you for joining. And as you can see, this is a quite raw discussion, very honest, not clear-cut answers that will satisfy. If you feel unsatisfied, welcome to philosophy. Welcome to philosophy, because you have to think really hard. And I don't have anything to sell you right now, but I will eventually. Anyways, so that's it, everybody. Thank you for joining, and until next time, peace.